Welcome to Extremes of the Human Experience, where we explore ideas and people, good and bad, to discover who we are as human beings and who we can be. On this episode of Extremes of the Human Experience, we will be looking into brain damage and the effects this damage can have on who we are. This video is dedicated to my brother, whose fascination with the brain gave birth to my own fascination with the brain. We have a tendency to think that our personalities as humans are static. While we can make changes, like becoming less critical or being more open-minded, these are conscious choices, and any deviations away from what we believe to be our personality are explained away as not really being us. In short, we like to think that our personality, who we are, is largely a matter of choice and somehow distinct from our brain. But let's lay waste to this idea. My fascination with the brain and the effects that damage can have on it began when I first heard the story of Charles Whitman, better known as the Texas Tower Sniper, or the first mass shooter in United States history. On August 1st, 1966, Whitman stabbed to death his wife and mother before climbing the observation tower at the University of Texas and opening fire with a high-powered rifle. On that day, Whitman claimed the lives of 17 people, and Austin police officers claimed the life of Whitman. As investigators began to unravel the mystery of the Texas Tower Sniper, they found a mountain of evidence detailing Whitman's deteriorating mental condition, a piece of which was his suicide note. In the note, Whitman says, "I do not quite understand what it is that compels me to type this letter. Perhaps it is to leave some vague reason for the actions I have recently performed. I do not really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I cannot recall when it started, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. These thoughts constantly recur, and it requires a tremendous mental effort to concentrate on useful and progressive tasks." Investigators also uncovered that Whitman had visited a number of doctors in the years leading up to the shooting, complaining of increased headaches and violent thoughts. Writing in his suicide note, "I talked with a doctor once for about 2 hours and tried to convey to him my fears that I felt overwhelming violent impulses. After one visit, I never saw the doctor again, and since then have been fighting my mental turmoil alone, and seemingly to no avail." In his note, Whitman requested an autopsy be done to determine if there were any discernible biological reasons for his sudden shift toward these violent tendencies. And lo and behold, a pecan-sized tumor was found on his brain. While neuropathologists were hesitant to say whether or not the tumor led to his actions on August 1st, some speculated that the tumor was pressing on his amygdala, the part of the brain associated with anxiety and our fight or flight response. Whitman ended his letter by stating, "If my life insurance policy is valid, please pay off my debts. Donate the rest anonymously to a mental health foundation. Maybe research can prevent further tragedies of this type." Our second example of the effects of brain damage occurred over 100 years before Charles Whitman and prompted perhaps the first research into brain damage and its effect on the human personality. On September 13, 1848, a tamping iron used to blast rock for railroad construction exploded through the head of Phineas Gage. Gage survived the accident and began to make a full recovery. Changes in his personality, however, began to emerge. Dr. J.M. Garlow, the physician who attended to Gage, stated, "The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, devising many plans of future operations, which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. A child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, he has the animal passions of a strong man. Previous to his injury, although untrained in the schools, he possessed a well-balanced mind and was looked upon by those who knew him as a shrewd, smart businessman, very energetic and persistent in executing all his plans of operation. So decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. This type of change in behavior indicates damage to the frontal lobe, the stop sign of our brain that puts a halt to the appetitive desires for pleasure that emanate from our amygdala. Frontal lobe inactivity is found in the brains of many criminals and psychopaths. Gage, though, slowly began to recover his social abilities, a recovery that is attributed to the structure that driving a stagecoach gave him following the accident. According to psychologist and author Malcolm Macmillan, Phineas's survival and rehabilitation demonstrated a theory of recovery which has influenced the treatment of frontal lobe damage today. In modern treatment, adding structure to tasks by, for example, mentally visualizing a written list is considered a key method in coping with frontal lobe damage. Phineas would take to bringing the tamping iron with him wherever he went, describing it as his constant companion, and would die on May 21, 1860, 12 years after his accident. While damage to the brain can result in violent and impulsive behavior, let's take a look now at a seemingly beneficial change that can result from damage to the brain, with the case of Daniel Padgett. Prior to being beaten into unconsciousness by two men outside of a karaoke bar, Padgett was a self-described jock who had dropped out of community college and showed little interest in academic pursuits. Following the attack, however, Padgett began to see shapes and angles everywhere in life, and began drawing these shapes. The drawings were eventually shown to Tim Chartier, a math and computer science professor at Davidson College in North Carolina, to which Chartier remarked, "It's remarkable that he sees the world this way without any real training. Is that genius? I think you have to be careful when you use that word, but yes, to be able to see that, that's just wild." Padgett is one of about 40 documented cases of acquired savant syndrome, whereby an individual displays a special talent in math, art, or music following a severe brain injury. Other examples include Orlando Sorrell, who, after being hit with a baseball as a child, found he could suddenly tell you the day of the week of any given date. Dr. Anthony Cisoria, who began adeptly playing the piano, an instrument in which he had never before shown any interest after being struck by lightning, and Alonzo Clemens, who, despite having a tested IQ of 40, could, after experiencing a fall, expertly sculpt any animal out of clay. While Padgett would need mathematical training to make any use of his acquired skill, and undoubtedly experienced several complications as the result of his injury, his experience may prove useful in discovering how the minds of mathematical geniuses work. Now, let's turn back to some of the bad behaviors with the case of a school teacher whose name has never been released publicly, who, in 2000, began suddenly showing interest in visiting prostitutes and collecting child pornography. After making sexual advances towards his stepdaughter, he was arrested and was set to be sent to prison. The night before his sentencing, he was rushed to the hospital after complaining of extreme headaches, and doctors found in his medical history that he had been knocked unconscious for 2 minutes years earlier. Performing a scan on his brain, they found a tumor, and after removing it, the man no longer exhibited any urges towards deviant sexual behavior. Months later, though, when he found these impulses had begun once again to emerge, doctors found that the tumor had once again emerged, and, following a second surgery to remove it, the man returned to normalcy. The man had lost his ability to control his sexual impulses, but had retained his knowledge of right and wrong, ignoring the long-term consequences in favor of short-term reward. Dr. James Cantor, a psychologist and sex behavior scientist, commented that the evidence suggests that someone who was already pedophilic all along lost the ability to hide it after the injury, and then regained the ability to suppress it as the neurological problem was treated. This example begs a question that has been asked on this channel before, the question being, are the worst and the best of our human behaviors the product of choice or neurology? Further, does the fact that a person knows a behavior to be bad play any role in his ability to control that behavior? Our final example questions what we believe to be one of our most unchangeable behaviors, our sexuality. What determines a person's sexuality is unknown, but we believe that once it is set that way, it stays that way. Well, most of us believe that anyway.
classify myself as ex-gay. You know, I'm a heterosexual guy who dealt with some homosexuality.
But let's take a look at the case of Chris Birch, a former rugby player who suffered a stroke at the age of 20. Prior to the stroke, he was engaged to be married to a woman. After the stroke, however, Chris found that he was attracted to men and eventually came out and started his new life as a hairdresser.
Strange in the sense that you walk into somewhere and all of a sudden you go from liking that girl to liking that boy.
Now, if you're conspiracy-minded, you might think that Chris discovered he was gay before his stroke and simply used it as a way of breaking otherwise devastating news to his fiancée. But, given what we have already seen regarding the wide-ranging effects of brain damage, the story he gives isn't much of a stretch. While this case does not serve to prove some people's beliefs that homosexuality is the result of brain damage,
and when your daughter starts acting too butch, you rein her in.
It does serve to show that something we believe to be as fundamental to our personality as our own sexuality can be changed by changes to our brain. So what's the point? The point is, even the limited knowledge of our brains that we've accrued in the past century poses serious doubts to our answers of who we are and why we are. Ideas of justice, of free will, and of the power of choice are all called into question, and as research progresses, it becomes more and more likely that future generations will look back on us and laugh at our flawed views of human behavior.
What makes you think she's a witch? Well, she turned me into a newt! A newt. Got better. Burn already!
Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, please give it a like and subscribe to our page to see more of our probing into the extremes of the human experience.